Mr. Chair, this is Andrew Stuffler. I'm the secretary to the board. I'm going to be asking that we wait until the fire marshal arrives to present. So we have quite a few people here. Well, we have more people than we normally get, which is maybe one or two. So it's kind of nice to see that we have interested people here and get a good discussion going. So we'll wait at least 5 minutes until here comes some of the fire prevention folks. So I think they may be on their way. anybody else have speaker slips that they want to turn in? We don't usually get speaker slips.
No.
So
Okay.
when you get to public comment, you'll just go through your stack. You only have one.
Okay.
We could get others.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay.
We can't require this, but we do ask.
Ask for 'em?
Yeah.
Okay.
Usually we have one person make the presentation, and then if they need, the board has questions, expert questions, you can refer to people and say, Mr. So-and-so, Ms. So-and-so's here to answer more questions on that if you have them. Is that going to be... I mean, we're not that formal. It's not... We just want to get everything out on the table so everybody knows what they're looking at. So we'll figure a way to make it work.
What?
Never guess who we've been waiting for. How you doing?
Good. Am I late? Did I have the wrong time?
No. You're on time. You're fine. You're fine.
Does it start right up?
Yeah, no.
Is everybody here from the appellants team? I know there were more people here and they're out in the hall. So. Yeah?
Well, that'll give you time to set up.
I have a flash drive and I have a flash
Yeah. What's that? I don't know. I know. Yeah, I don't know if he... I haven't talked to him since the last meeting, so I don't...
I know we've done this before. I could probably just add.
There you go. Boy, this is a big one. Big gal. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you'll need to log in.
There he is. Yeah. God damn it, it says 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock. And that one was, we couldn't get that one working.
But we want to get everybody. So the goal is to get everything out on the table. So how we can, we're not somewhere.
No, it's just good. I need to fish through the folders that I have on that thumb drive.
He just needs to open up the file, and then I can plug back in the keyboard. That was good audio.
Right now, just me.
No, we were waiting for the foreign. He just got here too.
Where's it okay?
Marshal. What's his title?
Do you have I was just wondering if you called the order. I was just wondering if you had called the order yet, or?
No, we haven't even started.
Okay.
Are we ready? The appellants, everybody here? Good? Okay. Mr. Chair, we're ready to
Good.
go.
Good. Good morning, everybody. Call this meeting to order. So we're going to have roll call. Bonnie Elliott.
Here.
James Langhorn.
Here.
Ken McClellan.
Here.
Juliet Sponsel.
Here.
Yeah, he's here. Juliet Sponsel. Vincent Wood.
Here.
Marcia Zellis.
Here.
Andrew Stuffler.
Here, and I would, Mr. Chair, ask that all the board members pull their microphones up close so that we get a good recording of this. Thank you.
Next will be, are there any amendments to the agenda that you would like?
Mr. Chair, I have no amendments to the agenda, but I would like to ask each of the board members to consider any communications they've had regarding the Kaduri property or project, or the people who will be speaking in front of us this morning as they come up to speak or give testimony. Testimony in the small t. If you need to disclose any ex parte, they are called communications you've had with these people outside of this hearing room as part of a hearing about this project and how that might influence you, whether you need to recuse yourself from the item or not. So that'll be something that I'm asking each of you to do now, and as the meeting goes, if something dawns on you, oh, I spoke with Amber about this 3 weeks ago, that's okay to also bring that forward during the meeting if it comes to mind. So at this point, has anybody had any communications with the appellant or about this property?
I have. Roy Hawthorne called me yesterday at home, started to talk to me about it, and I said I can't talk about it. And I hung up.
Okay. Do you feel conflicted in your judgment today?
I don't know. I can't quite answer that.
Okay. Well, if there's question or doubt, then you should probably recuse yourself. If you feel that it will not influence you one way or the other, then that's how you feel. Then you don't have to recuse yourself.
No, I can make a decision. I'm just disappointed but no.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
with Roy Hawthorne
Oh.
yesterday
Yep.
by telephone, and
Your mic's not on, sweetie. You need to pull it up.
I spoke with Roy Hawthorne yesterday by telephone. We both have a lot of experience in the historic preservation field. So I have my own opinions, and Roy has his own opinions. And he didn't try to influence me in any way. He just tried to get me to look at the references he makes or alludes to in the historic preservation issues of this. And so I said I would take a look at it. And I see nothing wrong with, having been on the Montecito Board of Architectural Review, one member approaching, a member being approached. I see nothing wrong with it.
So do you feel that communication would influence your decisions today?
Not in any way.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any communications? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Next, we're going to have a approval of the minutes from our last meeting.
I make a motion, we approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Bonnie, second?
Second, yeah.
All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Is there any public comment on items not on this agenda that anyone would like to bring up? No? Okay. Next would be the appeal for the 2931 East Victoria Street. Would staff like to present?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I believe we have the fire marshal here, who will be giving a presentation followed by the appellant.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'm Joe Pore, the Santa Barbara City Fire Marshal. I think the last time I was before you, I was accused of under-enforcing the code. This time I'm accused of over-enforcing it, so I must be doing something right. I'm going to present a very short, I hope, PowerPoint that basically outlines what the issues are and what the fire department's position is on the Kaduri appeal. First of all, in terms of background, the city adopts and amends the California Fire Code under the Municipal Code, in this case 8.04. Among sections adopted in the 2013 California Fire Code is the one I list there, 903.2.20.5, which calls for a change of use to a more hazardous use requiring the installation of fire sprinklers. And this is in commercial structures. Another requires sprinklers when you exceed 50% of a commercial space in terms of remodeling.
I'm just going to remind everybody who's speaking today that we do have a sign person here, so we have to make sure you don't speak like me and go really fast. So it's hard sometimes when we get kind of on the spot, but just make sure we're talking at a pace that can be signed and everyone can understand.
That also applies to me. So if I begin to speak too fast, give me a high sign and I'll slow it down. A change of use to a more hazardous use involves California Building Occupancy Code classifications. In this case, 2 B occupancies to an A occupancy or an assembly occupancy. In other words, they're combining 2 B occupancies to make a larger assembly. Assembly is any place used for the gathering of people where the occupant load is going to exceed 49, and that includes drinking and dining. The appellant proposes to combine 2 B occupancies to make a larger A for the purposes of expanding a commercial restaurant. The increased square footage and subsequent A designation also invoke other more stringent CBC requirements, such as additional exits. These things don't exist in a vacuum. So when we talk about sprinklers today, we're going to be talking about exiting as well and the change of use involved. Because in our view, the sprinkler issue by itself is a little bit of a cart before the horse, because we haven't actually seen a proposal to officially propose a change of use to an assembly occupancy yet. And we don't at this point know if that's even an approvable project. But in any case, we're here on the sprinkler appeal, and we'll talk about exits in conjunction with that. Generally, when you have an exiting demand of an assembly occupancy, you need a minimum of 2 exits. Those exits have to be separated by 1/2 the diagonal. Now, if you have sprinklers, you can decrease that to 1/3 the diagonal of the space served, and I'll show you an illustration of that in a couple of minutes. In addition to that, that second exit needs panic hardware, and it has to be clear to a public way. That means until you hit the sidewalk or the street, you're not clear of the exiting path. The greater the occupant load, the more requirements. For instance, emergency power for illumination or discharge and those kinds of things. Lighted exit signs, I'm sure that you've all seen them. In this case, this is an overview of the Kaduri building. On the right-hand side, you can see an already combined occupancy of the Kaduri restaurant. And then in the middle of the building is the remaining B occupancy, the tattoo shop. And then on the left, the gallery and the Kaduri pizza portions are the ones that are proposed to be combined into an assembly occupancy. That's a picture of it, and you can see the 2 archways in the picture are the 2 doors, one exiting from the gallery, one exiting from the pizzeria. And then as you go down the building towards Anacapa Street, you can see the Kaduri restaurant on the corner. And as you walk around the building, this is an alley or a service alley at the back of the building that exits out onto Anacapa Street, and that arched door is the way out of that particular area. So when you look at these 2 occupancies combined, on the left you have the existing Kaduri Pizzeria. On the right you have what is currently the gallery, a B occupancy. And the arrows pointing to the openings are the 2 proposed doors. So what they're doing is they're combining these 2 occupancies. Once you breach that wall, you no longer have 2 B occupancies of occupant load less than 49. What you have is a single A occupancy or an assembly occupancy. That kicks in the sprinklers, that kicks in the exiting requirements, and so forth. You can see the 2 arrows at the front are pointing to the 2 doors to the 2 occupancies. Those are the 2 that were under the archways in the photograph. And going back to that, you can see also how close they are. The applicant is, and I'm going to run a few sections by them. I'm going to try not to read them because I'm sure that you've read your packets. But the applicant has several California Historical Building Code sections that they're citing that say they relieve them of the requirements for sprinklers and exiting and so forth. And the only thing I'm going to say about this is that the California Historical Building Code does allow a lot of mitigation measures over what they call the regular code, in other words, the California Building Code. And while that is true, it doesn't allow you to do whatever you want. There are lots of requirements that are still in place, and one of them is that need for 2 exits. And even sprinklers, although the California Historical Building Code allows you a lot for sprinklers, it does not allow you to go underneath the required number of exits. So the 2 exit requirement, half the diagonal, would still stand. They talk about distinct hazard, that we're not showing a distinct hazard here, and this is the definition out of the code. Any clear and evident condition that exists as an immediate danger to the safety of the occupants in public right-of-way. Conditions that do not meet the current regular codes and ordinances do not of themselves constitute a distinct hazard. And they also take this section 8.302 that says that the use or change of use and occupancy of a historical building may be changed or returned to its historical use or character provided qualified historical building or property conforms to the requirements applicable to the new use or character of the occupancy as set forth in the Historical Building Code. The code also goes on to say that nothing in this part shall be construed to prevent authorized building or fire officials from the performance of their duties where in the process of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. And that, in our view, is what we are doing here. Local authorities still have authority to use discretion in the application of the code. And the state recognizes that each situation has to be evaluated on its merits. Local officials are allowed reasonable steps to ensure public safety. And if I can add, too, that the state also recognizes in the historical building code itself that sprinklers allow you a lot. Sprinklers will get you many things. And in fact, in a recent PowerPoint that I did not include in this package here, but it was a presentation by the California Historical California Preservation Foundation. They point out in several different instances where sprinklers actually will allow you a little bit of latitude in the code. Just by adding them, you can get out of certain regulations that would normally be required. So even the historical building code acknowledges the effectiveness of sprinklers. The applicant uses language like, our code analysis relating to creating openings between two currently distinct tenant spaces indicates that each room only requires one exit. The occupant load should not be added, and there is no reason for an occupant to go to the other exit in the event of an emergency.
Could you hold up just a second?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. This is not a code analysis, and it would not be accepted anywhere in California that I know of. When you combine these two B occupancies, you are creating an A occupancy. That requires A standards. And I'm not sure what they mean about when they should not be added and there is no reason for an occupant to go to another exit in the event of an emergency. These two exits out the front of the building actually collide with each other. And in a panic or a fire situation, you can't tell occupants of the building what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. They're going to try to find the nearest exit. And the applicant uses language like also the rear service doors, while not required exits, will be available with signage that they are to remain unlocked during business hours. This is again a misapplication of the code. The rear exit is required to have panic hardware, and that exit path must be clear to a public way, that is Anacapa Street, if they plan to use the rear exit. In this case, they're showing sort of a half exit, half not exit, where the door is to remain unlocked during business hours, but in fact, it's not a way that you would want people to try to exit this building, and I'll illustrate that in a second, too. But even if they were not, an exit, it's like a fire alarm. If it looks like one, it has to function like one, or you don't want it. You could actually be adding to the hazard by creating something that looks like an exit that's only going to be an impediment. And this is also from the California Historical Code that says automatic sprinkler systems shall not be used to substitute or act for an alternate to the required number of exits from any facility. So going back to their drawing, you can see that you have the two exits in front, you have the sort of exit in the back that's not really an exit, and this would be half the diagonal, this red line that I've drawn across the diagram. That's half the diagonal of the area served. So if you split that in half, the required exit from this occupancy, the second exit, would need to be a minimum of that distance away from one of those front doors. Now, if you added sprinklers, you could decrease that to 1/3. But again, they're not proposing to add sprinklers, they're proposing to not add sprinklers. This is the interior of the Dario Pizzeria, and that's the wall on the far side that the openings would appear in. And if you were to use that rear exit, that's the path you would have to take through that service alley. Now, if you look at the service alley, the red X that I have on Anacapa Street, you haven't exited the facility until you're at that red dot. So you have to make it down that service alley. This is the service alley in question. It's on the property line. It's congested, doesn't meet the width requirements, and there are exit obstructions pretty much throughout. And they're generally necessary. I mean, there are things like trash containers and things like that that they have to keep back there. There's no other place to put them. Now you're looking at it from the Kaduri restaurant end, and you can see that the door that, and this is part of the historical structure, obviously, this door opens inward. That's also a situation that's not acceptable in terms of exiting. It has to open outward and should be equipped with panic hardware like the rest of the exiting system. So this is why we believe this creates a clear and distinct hazard. The creation of an ad hoc assembly with inadequate exiting is a clear and distinct hazard to us. And again, back to the code, any clear and evident condition that exists as an immediate danger to the safety of occupants or the public right-of-way is a clear and distinct hazard. Change of use permit invokes sprinklers, requires 2 exits. The appellant points to several existing non-conforming occupancies, and it's well established that existing occupancies are not something that we go back and retroactively change if they were installed under the current codes at the time they were made. It's only when someone proposes to do a project that changes the nature of the building that we begin to invoke modern code standards. Among the reasons for not sprinklering the building, the applicant raises concerns about structural stability. This building was seismically retrofitted, as near as I understand, to city standards in the 90s. And in going back through the fire department history, we know of no known instances where the weight of sprinkler piping causes structural instability unless the building is structurally unstable in the first place. And not only that, but the applicant has added recent substantial HVAC units on the roof. And if structural stability were a concern, you would think that that would be one of their concerns as well. But in any case, structural stability is a separate problem. If the building needs to be evaluated by a structural engineer, that probably should happen first. Another myth is that sprinklers are incompatible with or otherwise detract from historic structures. This building is an 1889 building. It's at 409 State. And many years ago, they wanted to take it from a derelict hotel to a nightclub, which, as you can imagine, is a dramatic change of use. We worked with the applicant. We worked with the architect. We worked with it all throughout the construction. And this building has been retrofitted with sprinklers. Now, similar to the Kaduri project, the interior of this building is not by 1889 standards. The interior of this building looks like this. Now, and it's a nice remodel. It's got basically a first floor, a mezzanine floor, and then a second floor above that. But you can see in this photograph, if you look all the way up through the grid work, through the mezzanine to the ceiling, there's the old tin ceiling is still up there, the pressed tin ceiling. That hasn't been altered by sprinklers. That was covered with sidewalls. And if you look at the architecture below, basically you don't see any sprinkler heads because they're concealed heads. And that's if you want to have an architecturally pleasing look, that's the way you do it. You put in concealed heads and concealed piping. Here's another historical building that you might be familiar with. This is the Granada Theater. The Granada Theater and the Granada Tower are both fully covered with sprinklers. We did it retroactively about 10 years ago. And that includes the very ornate ceiling in the founder's room. If you've been up there recently, I would challenge you to have noticed any of the sprinkler heads that are actually present in the founder's room ceiling. But including this, this is a fully sprinklered building, and concealed heads, very difficult to notice. Another historical building, the Victoria Theater, recently done. Again, we worked closely with the architect, the contractors, and in all of these buildings that I'm going through here, we made all the historical building concessions because we're not going to get adequate exiting and perfectly, perfectly done construction according to modern standards. We're not going to have the rated construction that we would expect to have in certain parts of the building. Some exits are going to be too narrow, but it's a question of working through all of these problems on a case-by-case basis and finding solutions as we go along. El Encanto Hotel is another historical structure, a series of structures, all of which are sprinklered. And it doesn't detract from the looks or the ambiance of the hotel. I'm going to point out this place because it's an interesting building. It's called the Rehan House, and it's up in Fresno. The Rehan House is historical in that one of the founders of Fresno built this place and lived in it way back when Fresno was just a small farming community. Sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, it was remodeled by an architectural firm. They did a really nice job. On the inside, you can see they preserved the ornate stairways and the beautiful woodwork inside the house. In addition to that, Fresno keeps thousands of paper records in the basement that go all the way back to the founding of Fresno. Now, when the architectural firm did the remodel, they did everything as much as they could to code, but they worked under the historical building code as well, and they were not required to put sprinklers in because sprinkler ordinances didn't exist at the time. So they did not have to do that. This is the Rehan House last Wednesday. And the reason I point this out is because sprinklers preserve as much as anything else historical buildings. In this particular case, not only did they lose the Rehan House, they lost thousands of historical records that were stored in the basement. And this fire, as near as they can tell, started in the basement or right out at the back in the rear alley. Probably transient related, may have been somebody trying to keep warm. But in any case, the entire structure and all of those records are now lost. A single sprinkler head probably would have resulted in a fire like this. We get these all the time. This is a single activation of one single sprinkler head. Middle of the night, nobody on the premises. The sprinkler head controls the fire. The alarm goes off, we respond, and when we get there, we have nothing to do but stop the water. If this had been the Rehan House, all of those records and the house at large would still be intact. So when people say to us that, sprinklers detract from historical residences, I say that these are the very places that we need to protect. And sprinklers do a fine job at doing that. They also invoke in their appeal the Max Factor building. This was a 70s, actually I think it was the 80s, when this came before the Board of Appeals in Sacramento. And the LA Fire Department, I believe, wanted to install sprinklers in it, and the compromises that the board came up with were fully alarmed on all the floors. And until the alarm system went in, they had the fire department post a fire watch and so forth. And basically, they were turning this old Max Factor building into a museum and a conference room on the second floor. There have been decisions since then that run counter to this, and where sprinklers were involved, and the historical board went along with it. But in any case, this is a cast-in-place concrete building, and it's not a restaurant. The addition of smoke detection throughout a restaurant is inappropriate for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the numerous false alarms. And in the case of Kaduri, we're dealing with a restaurant. And so a proposal to, instead of putting sprinklers in, put an alarm system in would be inappropriate in this case. So summing it up, combining the spaces creates an assembly. It's a more hazardous, distinct hazard. particularly where exiting is inadequate, where clearly it is here. Sprinklers only mitigate to a degree, but they are a factor. And while sprinklers may not literally be in keeping with the historic 1922 design, neither is the assembly occupancy that they're proposing. The requirements here are created by the applicant. Okay. If the applicant were to do nothing and keep the 2B occupancies, in other words, not create those openings, there would be no sprinkler requirement, and the exiting wouldn't be an issue. And finally, there is an avenue of appeal beyond this board. They can go to the California Historical Building Code Board of Appeals. And they've been known to adjudicate these things in the past, so that they do have that available for these types of disputes. And that's all we have for the staff presentation. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them.
Chair?
Just go ahead.
Okay. I was wondering if you had any single-story examples of requested occupancy, because the examples we saw here, although very good, were 2, 3-story structures, and this is just a one-story structure, and so I was concerned that the examples
Absolutely.
were a little
One that comes to mind right off the top of my head is Dargan's.
Dargan.
Dargan's.
Okay, and they put sprinklers
Right.
in.
And again, the same situation.
Okay. They opened up to a wider space,
Right.
and had
Exactly.
to. Okay.
Vince?
Yes, in the architect's letter here, February 1st, 2016, he says precedents for projects similar to this one include Bouchon, Santa Barbara Roasting, the Palace Cafe, as well as Cadario Restaurant. Are you saying, I heard you say before, that there were people who had precedents, but it was because they didn't make changes at this late in the code? They made it a long time ago. Is that the case for the Bouchon, the Santa Barbara Roasting, and the Palace Cafe?
That's correct. Before the sprinkler code, the sprinkler requirements were in the code.
I have one question.
Yes.
And I apologize if I missed this earlier. You talked a little bit about occupancy is over 49 or 49 plus. What is the limit for Cadario, for both pizzeria and the restaurant?
It's going to be based on square footage, and we haven't been presented with the proposed occupant load yet. I think that they might have reported an occupant load of 80 to the ABC, but I haven't seen that permit. But it's based on square footage, and it comes from a formula out of the building code. For instance, if you have seating and so forth, tables, chairs, those kinds of things, the occupant load is generally 15 square feet per person. So we take the square footage, make that division, and that's how the occupant load is arrived at.
Thank you.
Yes.
A couple questions. Is this working?
I can hear you.
No.
What is your attic space? Do you have a crawl space there?
My understanding is that the concealed space is very narrow, but certainly enough to fit pipe.
Is it narrow enough to exclude a pipe fitter?
That I don't know. I haven't been up there.
Okay.
What? I'm sorry. Pipe what?
A pipe fitter.
Can I answer that?
Probably it would be a little out of order, but I mean, we can certainly get an answer
Okay.
to that. I think we'll hear that from the appellant. I think they have that information. So
Okay, could I get that list out there so they have it? Because I got a lot of information here. I feel like I'm drinking through a fire hose, even though I spent at least an hour and a half reading what was provided. So there are things that are important to me, and I'd like to put them out there so that
Sure.
those answers are forthcoming.
Mr. Chair, we're going to have, and board members, we'll have rounds of discussion. So I anticipate you're going to ask the fire marshal questions. You're going to get a presentation from the appellant. You're going to ask them questions. You'll be back asking the fire marshal questions, back to the appellant. We are going to, there's rebuttal and rebuttal to the rebuttal, and but that we have to follow that structure. So if the fire marshal's not aware, doesn't have that information right now, we can definitely find that. And when you get back to rebuttal, he can answer that for you if the
I'll wait, but it's coming.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the board?
I do have one more question. The alley, the service alley or whatever, where the trash was and all that stuff. If that was used as an exit for an emergency, I didn't notice. I tried to find out, is the door, is it level to the floor, or is there a step? So if someone is in a wheelchair, can they get out?
I believe there's a step there.
Okay. Thank you.
No.
Thank you.
Any other questions, board, or we'll move to the applicant who'd like to come up? Yeah, you do. Use the mic. Sorry. We'll share this one. Okay. Are there any other questions, board? Like to?
I just have one. So the only alternative to this situation is fire sprinklers installed in the building. There wouldn't be, I know sometimes in residential you can install a fire hydrant directly outside and that would be acceptable. That's residential, but I was wondering, is it we're just arguing over fire sprinklers, or is there any other alternate solution?
Different standards, actually. The fire hydrant would be involved in new construction of, say, a new building. It doesn't apply in this case. The applicant has proposed things like another mitigating measure, for instance. I believe that they talked about rated construction. Well, the rated construction doesn't apply here because they're actually creating openings and not closing openings. And I think they also talked about an alarm system. An alarm system would require smoke detection throughout the building. And smoke detection throughout the building kind of flies in the face of the whole marring of the interior look of the place, because smoke detectors are much more obtrusive than sprinkler heads. Sprinkler heads can be concealed. Smoke detection generally can't be. But in any case, because it's a restaurant, if you put in automatic smoke detection, the likelihood of false alarms is pretty close to 100%.
I was referring, I used that example as the fire hydrant, but I was referring to, is it acceptable where they're doing the new construction, creating these two new openings? Would it be acceptable just to install sprinklers in those, in the passageway between the two, and have a wider area that it spreads over? Or that's what I was looking more for.
Yeah, generally the code doesn't allow for partially sprinklered anything.
Yeah. And you wouldn't allow it in this particular, as an exception, I mean.
I don't think that it would, I don't think it would accomplish what a sprinkler system is supposed to accomplish.
Okay. And would you recommend that the rear exit not be allowed as an exit?
We would be happy to see a proposal. Anything that meets, a reasonable exiting scenario, but we haven't seen anything drawn up.
Okay.
That's sort of the applicant's bailiwick to propose that and put it on paper and say, we're claiming this as an exit. We're going to make it function as an exit. The doors are going to swing outward and so forth. I'm not a designer, so I don't know how they would accomplish that, but we'd be happy to look at it if they did.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to add that we have a proposal in front of us informally through the correspondence that's been moved between the applicant for the permit and the building department and fire department. So we are seeing some floor plans. We don't have a complete set of plans with a proposal because they like to know what exactly to draw up before they go drawing up complete documents and submitting them. So if you keep that in mind as you ask your questions and you kind of are analyzing this situation, it would be helpful to hear from you and keep in mind that the plans can change. They are in flux right now. There's not something set in stone, but we had to have a point to work from in order to have the discussion. So the drawings that are included in here are the discussion point drawings.
And if I could add one more thing to that, the building, in terms of the building code requirement for the A, we would also, entertain the official proposal to go through a change of use into an assembly occupancy. But that's not actually part of on the table right now at all, and should be. So that's one of the things that that in fact is happening. We just want to, if it's an assembly, let's call it an assembly.
Yeah, because normally in the fire exiting, we see fire exiting plans, and there's no fire exiting plan in here where the widths are determined in place in light of the occupancy,
Right.
And whether they're wide enough to accommodate, and whether these would all accommodate the occupants within the building itself, and that's not a part of these documents.
Right, and what we're saying is that the two front doors, although the historical code does allow them to swing in if they're the main exit, so that's one of those accommodations that the historical code makes. Although they'd be allowed to swing in, they're way too close together. They actually collide with each other as people are coming out, and that's not, as the applicant put it, a situation where the people trying to flee get to make rational choices about what door they're going to choose. And one more thing, the applicant also has not proposed another thing that the historical building code allows, and this I found kind of surprising, was that there are alternatives to a commercial sprinkler system that involve sprinklers still, but a lesser impact. For instance, a 13R system, which would be the type of sprinkler system you would install in, say, an apartment building, could be allowed. If we reviewed it, they proposed it, and we reviewed it. It's less impactful than a fully commercial system, and the historical code specifically allows for it. But they haven't proposed that either. All they've proposed is no sprinklers at all.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I do have a question. I don't know when it's appropriate for us to make just general comments or observations that we've seen at the restaurant, at their place of business.
I would encourage you to hold your general comments until after you've heard from the appellant as well.
Thank you.
Okay. At this point, would the applicant like to come up and present their...
Mr. Chair, so the appellant has kind of a cadre of folks that they're going to have sit behind them, kind of like the last hearing we had, so that they can turn to them if you have specific questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, while we're going through this transition, I just want to mention there is a meeting that starts in this room at 11 o'clock. So we have time, but just to be cognizant of that, especially as we get into like the 10:45 hour.
Hi, I'm Olivia Marr. Is this on? Yeah.
You have to get it pretty close. Okay. There you go.
I'm Olivia Marr. I'm here on behalf of appellant Kaduri. I'm an attorney with Bynock, Favre, Archibald, and Spray, and I'm really just here to make some introductions as to who we have here that can speak and answer your questions and are part of our presentation. We have Ellen Bildstein here, who is the appellant's architect, and she will speak to the points raised in appellant's letter. Appellant also had a fire sprinkler contractor and structural engineer evaluate the installation of the fire sprinklers, and both determined that installing the fire sprinklers would damage the hollow clay structure and otherwise undermine the structure. There was a note about the HVAC systems being installed recently on the building, and just note that those were replacement of HVAC structures, and the replaced HVAC structures were actually lighter and more efficient than the ones that were on there previously. So Ms. Bildstein will speak to the issue and other raised in the appeal letter. We also have a letter to read in the record from the structural engineer. Randall from RJ Fire Sprinkler Systems is here to discuss what it would take to install fire sprinklers at the building. And Roy Hawthorne is here as an unpaid code expert and a consulting building official. Appellant's architect has consulted with him on this issue in the past, but he is here as an unpaid volunteer and building code expert. Roy can speak to the code analysis and precedent.
Slow down just a
Sorry.
minute. It's like you're
course.
reading and I can't follow
no
quite
problem.
that fast.
You want me to start
Go
back?
back just a
I'm
few
getting
sentences.
reverb in my.
Board members, if you would push the little push button on your thing when you're not talking, it might help with the reverb. Vince has one on his there. There we go.
Okay. Appellant's architect has consulted with him on this issue in the past, but he is here as an unpaid volunteer and building code expert. Roy can speak to the code analysis and precedent of similar projects. Both Randall and Roy can come up and speak and answer questions after Ms. Bildston makes her presentation.
Good morning. I'm Ellen Bildston, the architect working with the appellant on adding some tenant space to the existing pizzeria that they have currently at 29 East Victoria Street. This is a plan of the entire building showing Kaduri Restaurant, which is a separate entity, a tattoo parlor here in the center. And this is the existing pizzeria space currently. There's a gallery next door. And the proposal is to make 2 openings in the wall between these 2 tenant spaces to expand the pizzeria into those 2 adjacent existing spaces. We're adding no additional square footage to the building. The only proposal is to create these openings. The existing pizzeria has the kitchen facility already built into it, and the primary use for this second area is for private dining room. There's a small kitchen area proposed that would be very minor and as a support to the primary kitchen area. So primarily this is about additional dining space. We heard from the fire official that the distinct hazard that's being defined in his evaluation of the situation, that we are far exceeding the occupancy of 49, which each of these spaces currently supports. Each of them individually has its own direct access from Victoria Street. We will in no way change that. So we're essentially doubling the amount of space that the restaurant will occupy, but we're also doubling the amount of egress width that's available to customers who come to what will be a combined space. But as much as it's combined, it's only due to openings in the wall, not additional space overall, but the same access that people had before to these 2 individual spaces will still be available to the combined space.
Ellen, can I, if you want to follow along on the drawing, the appellant included a sheet A0.1. It looks like this in your packet. It's about 3/4 of the way through your packet. But that might help you to follow the drawing that Ellen has.
I also have that sheet here, but graphically thought this was a little bit clearer.
It should be a plan drawing of the whole building. So it should show all 5 original tenant spaces, 4 current tenant spaces. Yes, 5 original tenant space. Well, I shouldn't say original, but the Kaduri restaurant at the corner is 2 tenant spaces that has an opening in between them.
To that point, I mean, as you see, there are 5 original tenant spaces, each of which has its own direct access out to Victoria Street. And there's nothing in our current proposal that would alter that same method of egress where folks showed up and entered the space in that way in the event of an emergency. Each of these spaces is less than 900 square feet total. So, and when we piece them together, we have a total of 1,793 square feet for those two spaces together. So it seems that the exiting, and particularly because this is a historically designated building, we don't have the option to add more points of egress for the customers of the business directly out to Victoria Street other than the two that we currently have. So to the letter that we submitted, we're requesting a code modification using alternate materials and methods, as well as acceptance of provisions found in the California Historical Building Code. All of this due to the fact that, in addition to the points I've made already, this is a historic building, and therefore we're operating under the State Historical Building Code as opposed to the California Building Code. The sections that we cite that are particularly relevant are the 104.8 and 104.9 of the city-adopted California Fire Code. Modifications we seek include the fact that the fire code official has the authority to grant modification for individual cases, and we believe that the fact that we're not adding square footage to the building in any way. It's a one-story building. It's purely commercial. There's no residential aspect to this building, and we're not changing anything about the square footage of the building. Should allow for granting a modification to the requirement for fire sprinklers. The background of this building is that it was built in 1922. It was constructed of plastered exterior demising masonry walls that have been seismically retrofitted. The historic building's aesthetics, history, and structural integrity would be seriously impacted and undermined by the installation of fire sprinklers. And we met, as mentioned earlier, with Randall at RJ Fire Sprinkler Company, and he'll speak to this in a few minutes. He was consulted to help us understand better what would be involved if we were to install fire sprinklers in the building. A few other factors to consider are the fact that this building has great proximity to two fire stations. Number 1 and number 3 are each just a few blocks away. There's a fire hydrant right down the street from the building. Mechanical systems of the two tenant spaces are today and will remain independent of one another. There's no mixing of the mechanical system between these two spaces. In addition to that, we're not in a high fire zone designated by the city, and few other buildings in the neighborhood currently have fire sprinklers. No known loss history or exposure to any hazardous conditions on the site are known at this time. So we did have, in addition to meeting with the sprinkler company, we also talked with a structural engineer. As Olivia mentioned, there is no other proposed added load to the roof with the change of HVAC equipment on the roof. It's replacing existing, and we're using less weighted units on the roof than there were before. So the only proposal for added load to the roof is what's being proposed with the fire sprinkler system. We had analysis done by studio engineers. I'll read the letter. Pursuant to your request, I've reviewed the structural calculations performed for a seismic retrofit in 1993 by Mustafa and Associates in relation to the effects that a new fully loaded sprinkler system would have on seismic capacity of the existing structure. Per the retrofit calculations in my review, the roof dead loading for the seismic loads of the structure is 28 pounds per square foot, and the dead loading for a fully loaded sprinkler system is approximately 3 pounds per square foot. This will increase the roof dead load by approximately 10% per the 2013 California Building Code Section 3403A.3.1. If the alteration increases the seismic forces by more than 5%, then the structure must conform to the requirements of a new structure. And we've hit 10% by adding the fire sprinklers to the building. Designing the structure for current code levels may require analysis of the existing hollow clay tile walls and anchorage of the hollow clay tile walls to the roof. New steel moment frames may be required at the front and rear of the space, inboard of the exterior walls but visible from the interior space, along with new roof sheathing and nailing. It's my understanding that penetrations will need to be made through the existing hollow clay tile walls. In my opinion, this is not advisable and will require reinforcing steel to support penetrations through the hollow clay tile. The extent of the structural upgrades will depend on the results of the analysis. The hydraulic sprinkler system will need to be seismically braced at the roof structure, requiring the addition of new bracing to new wood framing members. In my opinion, the addition of the sprinkler system will trigger a seismic upgrade of the structure, resulting in alterations to the structure that will have an aesthetic impact on this historic building. Please call with any questions. Respectfully, Joseph A. Tasca, P.E. of Studio Engineers. So, our position on this is that we're happy to do any sort of mitigating fire protection for the building for the public safety, but that fire sprinklers in this particular instance are not the right answer for a historic building that was not built to support it in the first place and would require quite a lot of demolition in order to accommodate such a system. So we thank you very much for being here today. I know we called a special meeting, and please consider our appeal. Thank you.
Before Ellen leaves, are there any questions?
Vince, yeah.
I just have one question. Which relates to that the fire department did suggest R13 sprinklers versus, and I'm not quite sure what system your structural engineer analyzed, but did he? Could you explain that to me?
He was looking at a commercial full system for the entire building, which was
the entire building, not just that space.
That's what we're being told by the fire
that's
department.
right. Yeah,
is
you're being told
required
to do the entire building.
The entire building.
Yeah.
So it would impact the other tenants in the building in addition to these folks who are doing this project.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Could I get my attic question answered now?
Yes. The clear space, it's a truss, a wooden truss roof support system that has 2 feet between the bottom of the top cord and the top of the bottom cord.
Okay. How about the roof? What is the history on the roof? Its composition, its age?
It's a membrane roof. There are a number of mechanical units up there on the roof. There have been from the beginning. There was no other space on the site for.
Do you know how old the roof is?
I mean, the structure is original to the 1922 building.
But the roof hasn't been replaced since 1922?
The finish, I'm not certain,
Okay.
but not the structure of it. The structure of it is original.
My questions are all going to the practical difficulties associated with doing the work, so that's where I'm leading this. Next question. Again, I looked at some of the drawings that were given to me, and it suggested a new bathroom was being added to address the increased load.
Correct.
What is the plumbing strategy there? Is it going to be flush valves, or are we going to have tanks? What's
Yes.
the water demand in there?
It'll be from below through the slab, so none of that would impact the structure of the building.
I'm looking at the water surge you're going to have to operate the bathrooms, the toilets, to get the fluctuation of people in and out of the bathrooms, how much water will be available. And so, from my experience, I'm gauging this on whether you have flush valves or not.
Mm-hmm. Randall, would you be able to speak to that? Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Just so people understand what I'm looking at the prospect that we're going to be using smaller pipes, we're going to be considering smaller densities, we're going to be considering lighter weights, we're going to be considering lighter costs, we're going to be considering distributed loads, not focused loads. We're going to be considering a water supply, which is much smaller, that could perhaps be that which is being brought in for the domestic use as well. So what I'm getting at is the practical difficulties here of making this happen. We can get into the architectural aesthetics and such later, but I just wanted to address those issues if I could.
Did you say now that the existing Cadarios obviously doesn't have a sprinkler system, right?
Correct.
And was that because that restaurant was built, the inside of the building was modified for the restaurant prior to the sprinkler requirements? Is that true? Okay. Now, the second question, I must have misread this. I thought the only place that had to be sprinklered was this new remodel. You're saying the whole building has to be sprinkled. Is that right? Okay. That makes it a big project.
Mr. Chair, I have one last question, and it regards the windows in the front. How high is the sill height in the front?
I believe it's about 20 inches from
20
the ground.
inches.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be considered. Have you looked at breakaway when replacing them to look original, but that they could break away in a case of an emergency? My main concern is, when there's a fire, I kind of tend to err on the side of the fire department, mainly because of the people tend to act very erratically. And the one thing that comes to mind is that fire in Rhode Island, because I spent a lot of years living in Rhode Island, and it was a nightclub, and they had fireworks. Of course, they generated fireworks inside, but the people in the panic to get out, they just toppled one on top of the other, and somehow might it be considered making some kind of windows that could break away in the event that there was that type of need for exiting?
If we were to propose that, I think we would need to go before HLC, since we're
you'd
a
definitely have to do
historically
that.
designated building. I'm not certain if that breakaway could go all the way to the ground for a handicap.
Oh, I wasn't referring. I was thinking it would be enough. 20 inches would be enough to be considered. You could get out the windows to be used as access, as exits. That's all I was looking at, just in terms of code issues.
We would have to look into that.
Okay, thank you.
So next sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you have a question?
No, go ahead. I was just going to ask the board if they had any other questions. Go ahead.
Our next speaker is Randall from RJ Sprinklers to share with you his observations during the site visit and his understanding of what would be involved in installing fire sprinklers in the building.
Are those full height clay?
Yes.
They are?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hello, my name is Randall Kazir, President, RJ Fire Sprinklers. On a site visit late last year, I was asked to discuss with the architect the feasibility of putting in fire sprinklers. In my observation, the attic space is too small. A human being cannot physically get into this attic to make up the pipes. Therefore, there's two ways of doing this. I can expose all of the pipe in the whole entire building, or I can basically make 4x4 squares every place I need a sprinkler, or maybe 2x4. I need a space big enough in a ceiling every 12 feet to stick my body through there to get pipe in. Basically, the pipes are about 12 to 14 feet long, so in that case, I may need to make longer holes in the ceilings so that I can protrude that pipe up into the attic. And I have a plan here that I kind of haphazard drew for the architect. It shows...
Randy, just real quick. Board members, this is the third to the last page is the plan that he's referring to.
Yeah, there won't be any sprinklers on there. I've drawn it on here. Oh, yeah, she did. All right.
Got a good architect.
Cool. Okay. So from the beginning here out there on... Okay.
It should show the fire sprinkler sketched over the floor plan.
Okay. Starting at East Victoria Street, the backflow device here with a couple squares and a triangle, that's the backflow device. That is underneath the windowsill, and that will be exposed. And then at the right side of that little open circle there is the pipe that's going to go up into the ceiling or the attic. And then you have a main which goes from front to back. It will most likely be 2.5 to 3 inch. And then the line pipes go horizontal across the building 3 times. And I was just informed by the architect that these dark walls are all full height clay. So that means I will have to go through these walls 3 times, each one of them. So I got 3, 6, 9, 12 holes in these walls. So basically the 2 ways to do the fire sprinklers is expose all the pipe, but when I expose all the pipe, all these open circles, they have to go through the ceiling to the attic for attic sprinklers. At the same time, they will go down for floor coverage. The only other way to do this is if you wanted to conceal all of this pipe, you would basically rip out most of the ceilings in the entire job if you wanted to conceal it, because I'd have to get the long pipes up in the attic and hang it and brace it and get men up there, and since there's no access to really crawl, I have to make large holes about every 12 feet to get to every fitting and every sprinkler. And that's about all I have.
A question, are you going to have to run that 4-inch pipe and dig up the street and tie into the main?
Yes. And go across the sidewalk.
Mr. Chair, a few questions. Randy, did you consider a third way, and that is to run your pipe along the top of the roof as you and I have done before?
With black iron, then how would you do that? Run all the drop pipes through the roof?
Yes.
So you'd have 50 holes in the roof?
Yes.
They'd have to waterproof 50 holes in the roof.
Yes. The technologies today, both in roofing and sprinkler, have changed from what historically was there. This ordinance is a historical ordinance. This threshold for putting sprinklers in existed before this building was purchased. It was before I even started in this career, it's 30 plus years ago. So this is something that was out there, it's been there, and we've only done things to improve that situation. A project I have that I'm working pro bono on is at my parish church. It's nearly as old as this. It's 1925, St. Joseph's, not St. Joseph's, it's Mount Carmel. And we're going to do exactly that. We replaced a roof, and we're going to make those penetrations through. And we're going to do that. It's going to be small pipe. I know you work with copper. It's much lighter than cast iron. You know the densities and design areas here are much smaller than a standard industrial strength sprinkler system that people are trying to suggest would be appropriate here. We don't have the loading issues. We don't have the aesthetic issues. We don't have the cost issues that are being suggested.
Board? I do have one question. What kind of figure do you have on putting a sprinkler system in this building? Have any costs involved yet?
Including the underground, it's $38,000.
Yes.
Would you repeat that?
Doesn't include the demo of the roof or replacement of all the ceilings. Massive.
You should be up here talking, not up back there. Thank you. I have a question. The question would be, again, what sort of a water service do we have coming into the building already? You know, if we've got a 2-inch line serving a flush system, you're going to have enough to supply the type of sprinkler system necessary here. What are the city water pressures here? If you have pressures over 50, 60 pounds, you'll have enough to do this. What you don't want to do is tear up that street and put in a whole new service dedicated to the purpose of a sprinkler system. And the technologies that exist today allow for that. Randy did that in a retrofit of a fire station that we surrendered to private industry after we left. And it all went in. It did not go in with big black pipe. It did not go in with a lot of structural engineering analysis. It did not suffer any problems. It's been standing there for 25 years. It did not destroy the project.
And that would probably work if it was approved by Santa Barbara City Fire, because that would be a different application than commercial.
Well, everything I've heard suggests that they're trying to work with you.
Yes.
I have to turn my mic on. Mr. Chair, the appellant may have more speakers that she wants to bring up, so if there are no more questions for Randy, we can move to the next speaker. And we do have about 35 minutes, so let's just make sure we kind of keep that in mind.
All right.
I will also say that if we get to the point where the meeting has to adjourn because of the following meeting, and we don't have a decision, we don't have to rush our decision. We can set another time and date to finish the discussion.
I have a question. Can I'd like to address the fire marshal. This proposal.
Vince, real quick, the appellant is still giving testimony. When they're done, then we can go back to rebuttal.
Our next speaker is Roy Harthorn to speak to the code issues involved in the historic designation of this building and Roy Harthorn.
Chair, I'm going to defer for 1 minute to Phil Suding, who has a time commitment. He has a brief statement to make. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is, I'm used to it being green. Good morning. My name is Philip Suding. I'm the chair of the Historic Landmarks Commission for the City of Santa Barbara. I'm here on behalf of the Historic Landmarks Commission to urge this board to work with the applicant or the appellant and the fire marshal or the fire official to come up with a agreement or a method to protect this historic resource in a way that doesn't impinge or alter the resource in any way, or at least minimally. I'm speaking on behalf of the Historic Landmarks Commission. As you know, the Historic Landmarks Commission is very interested in preserving historic resources in this city. We work hard twice a month to do that. So I really think that there is a provision in the historic building code that this solution, this life safety solution, be worked out without structurally inhibiting or impeding the resource. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, members, the chair. My name's Roy Harthorn. I'd like to first give a little overview of my presentation so you have an idea of each step. So when I get to a point where you have a question, it may be answered in the topic that will follow. First off, I'm going to give an overview of the hierarchy and interrelation of different building codes in California. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about what they say and what they do not say. I'm also going to talk about other jurisdictions outside the city of Santa Barbara, because there's been testimony here about the fact that this is all coming out of the building code or the fire code, and those are state codes. However, City of Santa Barbara has a very rigorous amendment which is at issue here in this hearing. Outside the City of Santa Barbara, we would not be here. The county, this requirement does not exist. City of Carpinteria, Montecito, Summerlin, other jurisdictions within the county, there is no requirement for installing sprinklers in a building under 5,000 square feet, which this is by a very safe margin, when there's a change of use. I'm also going to talk about various historic building code exceptions. As a little background, I have 30 years in plan check experience with the City of Santa Barbara and 5 other jurisdictions which I professionally do work for. I'm also going to speak to appeals that were heard at the state level. I am a member of the State Historic Building Safety Board in Sacramento. We are a 21-member board that maintains and writes the code sections for the Historic Building Code, and we also hear appeals. I represent California building contractors, and my particular position is appointed actually by the board itself. So I competed with a number of very competent people and was chosen 19 years ago to be a member of the contractors. Other representatives include the State Fire Marshal, includes Caltrans, the Department of Historic Preservation, Housing and Community Development, the Division of State Architect, as well as professional organizations including the Structural Engineers Association, fire protection engineers, as well as architects and other engineers. I'm also going to speak about when there are conflicts in the code, because there are very specific provisions which dictate which provision prevails. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about precedents here in the city of Santa Barbara. Okay, as far as authorities, codes are actually created in California by state law. The legislature, through the Health and Safety Code, prescribes which codes are enacted and who they are enforced by. Local adoption is an option that is given by the legislature of amendments, particular things that are unique to a particular area that a local jurisdiction has interest in. Those are called local interests. So there is both state and local enforcement of building regulations. Certain items the state fire marshal themselves regulate, many of which they delegate to local fire officials. And then the Building Standards Commission, who actually adopts all these various codes, also delegates the enforcement authority to local agencies first, that being cities, counties, special districts. They also retain their own area of interests, which they delegate to specific departments, like the Division of State Architect, who regulates schools and hospitals. OSHPD handles hospitals. So there are state interpretations of code, and then there are local interpretations. And there are appeals at both the local and the state level. And as the fire marshal mentioned, this particular issue is appealable to the State Historic Building Safety Board in Sacramento, should the appellant not be satisfied with the outcome. There's also the potential for adjudication if there is some problem with procedure or what have you that might involve the courts. So the applicable codes, first and foremost, is the California Historic Building Code. It actually has the prevailing, most high-ranking authority over this issue before you today. If you go into the California Building Code, if you go into the California Fire Code, each of those documents quickly says, go to the Historic Building Code for your answers. And specifically, in both of those codes, it says, if there's a change of use, you go to the Historic Building Code. You don't go to the regular provisions of the building code or the regular provisions of a local ordinance. And here, in particular, you don't look at the local amendments because they're superseded by state law. The state specifically says that we're going to accept a reduced level of safety that is acceptable for the preservation of historic buildings. And when we're talking about acceptable levels, we're talking about different things with different projects. If it's the Granada building and you have major benefactors that are donating tens of millions of dollars and completely taking down the building to the ground and rebuilding it or removing all the finishes, of course you're going to install sprinklers. 409 State Street, Savoy Theater. It's now a different nightclub, but I actually did the plan check in 1988 or 89, and the Historic Building Code was used. And partial sprinklers were allowed for protection of openings on side property lines. It was later decided that it would be a good idea, through the number of remodels and the amount of remodeling activity, to do the sprinkler system. However, they could have rightly come before the fire marshal and this board and the state and asked for relief as well. So there are other codes as well that come into play. The Uniform Code for Building Conservation was adopted by the city to retrofit over 300 brick buildings in Santa Barbara. It was a very onerous requirement that cost the city several $100 million in construction costs. It improved the safety of Santa Barbara dramatically. Fire often follows earthquake, and if you can hold the building in place, you're going to reduce the fire risk considerably. That ordinance went through over 32 public hearings and was an exhaustive process. It went through landmarks, it went through this board, and I don't know if the fire sprinkler ordinance came through this board or not, but it should have. So I want to cover a few specific items in the codes. Definitions, distinct hazards. One scenario in a change of use in the historic building code where the fire official trumps the relief of a sprinkler requirement or a change of use requirement is where there's a distinct hazard. Now, the distinct hazard was elevated to an extreme level. It's equivalent to what is referred to in the Uniform Code for Abatement of Dangerous Buildings and the Uniform Housing Code as a dangerous building. And under city ordinance and state law, any dangerous building shall be enforced by the building official or the fire official. You don't get to just look the other way because it was built before a code was adopted. So, the precedence of the Cadario restaurant itself, it was remodeled not long before the 2009 requirement for sprinklers in all changes of uses regardless of size. There was an exemption that was there, Jim, for at least 40 years for buildings under 5,000 square feet. That exemption was removed in 2009. It does not have any level of exemption. So if you change the use of one room under this current ordinance, say it's 50 square feet, you have to sprinkler the entire building that room is sitting in. It's a problem with the ordinance. It needs to be reworked. The California Historic Building Code also speaks to existing uses. It says the use or character of occupancy of a qualified historic building or property or portions thereof shall be permitted to continue in use regardless of any period of time in which it may have been remain unoccupied or in other uses, provided such building or property otherwise conforms to all applicable requirements of the California Historic Building Code. As it turns out, there have been as many as 4 different restaurants in the 5 spaces of this building over time. And there is a long history of openings being created between these 5 tenant spaces and then being closed in. Restaurants come and go. Other opportunities, other tenants come back, and Dana's Toys actually opened a beer bar in the back of the store back in the 40s. There was a restaurant and drinking facility associated with the a bank. I'm suddenly blocking on the bank, but it's a well-known bank in the 40s that was in the 33 East Victoria space. So these spaces have historically been used for drinking and dining. I also want to speak to what both the building code and the historic code say as far as classification of occupancies. In both cases, and this includes the fire code, it says that you apply the classification to either the building or the room, a portion of the building. So, if a tenant space does not doesn't have room for more than 50 occupants, it remains a B occupancy. Current code provides for this. And the State Historic Building Code Board has provided informal advice of this in the past. Former building officials. My predecessor, Chuck Dreyer, his counterpart in the fire department, Monroe Rutherford, who was fire chief, myself as building official, and with Warner McGrew, fire marshal, permitted this exact same arrangement in a variety of buildings. Going back in time, this is dating us a little bit, Alex's cantina that used to be at the corner of Ortega and State Street on the southwest corner in the Fithian building. That was 2 double B occupancies with a single door towards the front for the maitre d' to direct you to one side or the other. There was an additional passage further back. Same thing occurred at the Palace Cafe, Musso Adil, which is in the same building further down. And then more recently, I believe Mr. Lamone plan-checked a project at Santa Barbara Roasting, which is down on Motorway. And interestingly enough, at the time, the fire marshal, John E. Wilkinson, expressed more openness being allowed. In fact, they have a bar with about a 15-foot long opening in addition to a front and back passageway between the 2 B occupancies. So there's plenty of precedent. I see it all over there. It's on the Mesa, Rose Cafe, Upper State Street, Opal Restaurant, and even since the 2009 ordinance, Bouchon built a permanent enclosure where the former canvas structure used to be that wasn't previously counted in the occupant load, yet it obviously should be today. So there's plenty of precedent for both the building official and the fire official and this board to grant this modification, as well as to consider mitigations. Our board, in the max factor appeal, for example, that was a type 1 non-combustible structure. It was 4 stories. It, contrary to the fire marshal's statement, does have drinking and dining on the 4th floor. When events are held up there, they often have openings. They rent the space out. And the State Historic Safety Board did approve a alternative in the form of heat and smoke detection, and it's working. And it was approved and sanctioned at the highest level in California. And in a much higher occupancy building, they have occupant load events up to 300 people. Another building which Mr. Poirier may have alluded to is the Castle Green structure, where our board once again relieved any requirement for sprinklers. However, the owner, on their own, chose to put in some sidewall sprinklers in some select places. However, a very large assembly area of upwards of 500 or 600 people is unsprinklered except for the perimeter. We also have accepted by state code alternative exits, in particular fire escapes. Fire escapes are not permitted in current building codes. They haven't been for a long time, but they are in the California Historic Building Code. And on the max factor building, they were acknowledged as one means of exiting, as well as a spiral staircase, which absolutely is not recognized. So when you're looking at a building with a service alley, which Mr. Poirier says exits to Anacapa Street, it is a means to get in and out of the building, and it can be used as a condition. You can ask for panic hardware. You can ask for restrictions as far as what is out there and when. I'm sure that the main problem with obstructions occurs very late at night or early in the morning when there's trash being disposed of and it has to be stored until it can be picked up. So perhaps more frequent pickups. As far as exiting the door over the sidewalk or swinging in, there is a city ordinance which prohibits swinging any gates or doors over a city sidewalk, and in fact, that has been waived by the fire department in former cases, in particular with Papagayos on the De La Guerra Plaza, where the gates are allowed to swing in for occupant loads far in excess of 50. So I think I'm getting pretty much to the end of my presentation. I do want to point out that the existing kitchen in the pizzeria, as well as in the Kaduri restaurant, is protected with Ansel fire suppression equipment. So that is there. The kitchen in its hood does have fire protection. The building in question is a Type 3 1-hour building, as rated, determined by previous permit records. And Type 3 involves a 4-hour exterior wall. So essentially the exterior walls and, for that matter, the interior demising walls, the main ones, are non-combustible. So there's natural fire breaks throughout this building. So in closing, I want to reiterate that the only requirement for this building to have sprinklers is in the city's local adoption of the code. And once you step outside the city and look at the state fire code by itself, city building code by itself, changes of use, even involving more hazardous occupancies, including A assembly occupancies, do not trigger fire sprinkling if it's under 5,000 square feet. This whole property is only 5,000 square feet. And I understand that the building itself, the gross area, is on the order of 4,500 square feet. Let me quickly look over my notes and see if there's anything that I have left out, except one last thing. I have consulted with several experts in the field of historic buildings, as well as regular code. My mentor in exiting provisions is Jay Woodward, plan check engineer and chief architect for the International Conference of Building Officials. And he has provided training in this room as recently as 25 years ago. He's toured throughout the country. He's in high demand. I asked him what his feelings were on this. He said, well, in his opinion, some additional passageways between two neighboring B occupancies would amount to improved safety, inasmuch as there are alternate ways to get out. You're going from having one, perhaps two per space, to as many as 4 ways out of those combined spaces with these additional proposed passageways. So in his summary, he felt that if there's no increased hazard, there's nothing to be concerned about. I've also consulted with Richard Conrad, former director of the State Historic Building Board, former mayor of Ojai, city council member, and the executive director of the Building Standards Commission. He recognizes the double B occupancy and says it's a valid consideration today. And in closing, the last expert, Mel Green, structural engineer and former member of SEOC. He wrote the uniform code for building conservation that was the backbone of our ordinance, and he points out that the two basic approaches to solving life safety problems are, one, evacuation from the building, and two, suppression. So getting people out quickly and early is foremost, and then you worry about the building and saving its contents or the property itself. Life safety first, you get the people out, and then you consider the buildings and the sprinklers and what benefit they might provide. I'm not sure if it's appropriate for questions to be posed of me at this point, but I would be happy to entertain them if there are some.
Board, anybody have any questions, comments?
Mr. Chair, I'm going to just add that we are about 10 minutes from having to be out of the room. So I would like us to, the board, to give you some feedback on whether we need to have more discussion at a future meeting, or if they think they're going to be able to ask questions and get a good enough understanding to give a decision.
Mr. Chair, I agree. My thoughts are that we need a continuance on this, as we can't make a good decision with what little time remains.
Mr. Chair, I just have one quick question. The fire department had a recommendation, and I'm asking if you can give us your recommendation based on you have some very good references and very knowledgeable people you cited, and I'm wondering, do you have a recommendation? That's
early on when I was first asked in passing in the course of other plan check activity, what do I think? Well, first and foremost, my thoughts are that the sprinklers are simply not required in this condition. It's state law. The state law trumps the local regulation. It actually pushes you back into the regular building code and alternative codes, as well as prior decisions of the board in the appeal.
Roy, I'm going to just butt in real quick. Is that the question you're asking, or were you asking if you had documented recommendations from the references?
Yeah, I would like to see
I'll finish that very quickly. Yeah. And my suggestion was to propose, as others have in many cases, including here in Santa Barbara, to previous fire marshals, heat and smoke detection, early warning. And it's accepted and has been an appealed item and approved at the state level, and submitted to the fire department as a code modification, which of course was denied. So that was my recommendation. Again, as a member of the public, as a knowledgeable code official, I have no property interest, no financial interest in this project whatsoever.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roy.
So I would like to ask the board again, are we going to, it seems like we're going to need to set another meeting date. Our next meeting date that's scheduled is March 3rd at 2:30. It's a regular meeting that we have on our calendar. We set earlier this year. As an option, if the board would like, someone could make a motion, second, and there could be discussion on having a meeting on February 25th from any time between at 9 in the morning. And that could go on until 3 p.m. if it had to. Hopefully it won't, but that's an option if you'd like to move it up 1 week, it looks like, to February 25th. So with that, I'll leave that to the board to make a motion and discuss.
Good. Yes. Jim?
Oh, you had a comment down here.
March 3rd. Just postpone it. Give us time to think. Visit the place, maybe even look at it, and then come back. I'd like to see what it looks like. See how the openings are.
Mr. Chair.
Windows and so forth.
Okay.
Accessibility.
Mr. Chair, I would move for the 25th because I'm going to be at my daughter's senior recital back east on the 3rd, so.
I'll second. Yeah.
Even though that's my birthday.
Oh.
The 25th?
February 25th? Are you doing the 24th, 25th? What?
25th.
Is it Pat? Pat's your birthday?
No.
Mine's the 24th. That's why I'm asking.
This is the 24th. Okay, so we have a second for the 25th at 2:30.
I have one quick question about the 3rd. Is there going to be is there another agenda item for the 3rd, or would we be relieved of the 3rd for the 25th?
That is an option, Mr. Chair. If the board elects, you can make the February 20. If the board decides to have a February 25th meeting, you could make that your regular meeting.
Regular meeting? Yeah. Okay.
And we would cancel any meeting that we have no agenda for. So we may just do it that way.
Okay. Anyone like to make a motion for that?
I'm making that
Okay.
a motion.
You make a motion?
Yes.
Anyone second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, could someone please state the motion? Because we had two motions on the floor at the same
The
time.
motion is to cancel the March 3rd meeting and move it to February 25th
At 9 a.m.?
at 9 a.m.
Okay. And all the board members understand that to be the motion?
Yes.
Nodding, everybody? Okay, thank you. You can follow through with the adjournment of the meeting if you'd
Okay.
like.
Call for a motion for adjournment.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Marshal and Vince.
Yeah.
Thank you, board members. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Important decisions.
Yes, and I'll send out an agenda.